All right. So what are the role of these curse tablets that also have this element of they're skinny little metal things with writing on them? They're not doing all that I said with Lamb there and the heraldry. They're skinny little magic ritual implements. Well, we read from Radcliffe Edmonds about how one sort of mystical figure, who is in fact yet another one of these Thessalian witches, Thessalos was famous for witches, who had these lamella, these curse tablets, amongst her stock. First, she arranged her deadly laboratory. Okay, I like deadly laboratory. With its customary apparatus, setting out spices of all sorts, unintelligibly lettered metal plates. That's what we're talking about here. The surviving remains of illum and birds, and numerous pieces of mourned and even buried corpses. Here, noses and fingers. There, flesh-covered spikes from crucified bodies. Elsewhere, the preserved gore of murder victims and mutilated skulls wrenched from the teeth of wild beasts. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later in this lecture about a coefficient of weirdness. When you are describing people to do magic, they're described as weird. And their weirdness is part of it. It's the weirdness that gives them power. So in this depiction of a famous witch, we see that she does all sorts of creepy things, but she also has these curse tablets. Now, these were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. So Plato actually describes these binding curses called katodesmoi, and they were used to be used against the just and the unjust. They were used to bind, we'll talk about this more, binding a rival or an enemy. Now, Plato was writing 300 to 400 BCE. We find these materials all over the place and can date them much later. And then in the Greek magical papyri, which because of their original Latin naming is we go by PGM. I know it's fine. The Greek magical papyri date from the 2nd to 4th century CE. So we can just set out right here, roughly 800 years of these things being used. And we find troves of them even in Britain, where the Romans had held England for quite some time. In fact, in the city of Bath, we read about a whole giant trove of these cursing spells and figures. So the Greek magical papyri, like I was saying, show rituals and recipes to actually make these types of curse tablets. Now, the Greek magical papyri, remember, are not Hellenic. They're Hellenistic. So they're Egyptian. They're Greco-Roman. These are written. They are inscribed. They use the names of people. So this is important when we're looking at them. People are named. The person who made them knew how to write. They were literate. Writing itself is a magical act, and we find this in quite a number of cultures that we're going to see. So this suggests that the people who are using these and making these rituals were actually literate, were actually learned, possibly in multiple languages, and the ability to write. The operators, these performers of rituals, would obviously also chant and perform other rituals in addition to the writing. So they would do offerings and make incantations and whatnot in addition to inscribing. But the inscription is very important. The simplest form of inscription is just the name of a target, victim, perhaps with a verb of binding. But some of the later examples contain lengthy and complex texts. The curse's action upon the target is described in a variety of ways, as binding or binding down the target. So this katodesmoi was right here, defigiare or legare, in Latin meaning like to bind, to ligature. As register, so the target is described as having a couple of things. One, as being bound and bound down. Also, we see another element of the ritual, which is registering and writing down the name of the target. The target is named. Also, dedicating the target or dedicating the ritual to some sort of deity, dedicare, devotare. Sometimes a drawing is added to the text. The image could be an effigy of the person, or the image itself could be part of the ritual. It's not the person, it's that image does something. What's important to see here is 3 common elements in these curse tablets. 1, a verb of the result, binding the target, the name of the target, and 3, some superhuman power that will affect this. And as we'll see in a second, sometimes that superhuman power is the ritual itself and the words of the ritual. So how are these darn things deployed? Where do we find them? So they could be rolled up and deposited in all sorts of places. They're often found in graves. They're often found in wells. They would often be pierced by a nail. So you would make this like metal thing, like look to your left here. You can see that metal thing that's unrolled. Now you look to the right, that's where they found that thing. It was in a grave. So if it's pierced, if they roll up the metal thing and stick a nail through it, and they talk about specifically nails from shipwrecks being important there, that really gives a sense of the curse is you're taking the metal plate that tells you the curse that binds, and you're piercing it to bind it further. The spell binds, and you're binding the spell item itself, which is kind of cool. There are some other references in these recipes to knots and strings, as in like you tie up the lead thing after you fold it. All of this has elements of binding. Now, we do also see these sort of voodoo type dolls that we're going to see all over magical traditions, because I think there is something in our cognition. There's something about the human brain that says, I want to make a doll of somebody and do something horrible to it to make it happen. That I think that's in our cognitive structure somewhere, which is why it's so universal. So we do find these voodoo type dolls at crossroads, usually at crossroads. Now, these figurines were not necessarily an effigy of the target. It's more like, it's like the less well they're rendered, the fewer details, you get the sense that they're more effective that way, the vaguer they are. In this sense, the image might not be an effigy. The image itself might be a thing that is doing something, be an implement in the ritual. Graves and wells were the most common places. But what you need to remember is these things are secret. They're deposited somewhere where they radiate malevolence. They're not publicly declared.